Welcome to Scotland and a very warm welcome to Glasgow. It's the largest city in Scotland with nearly 1 million people. In the past it's been a hugely industrial city with the River Clyde running right through the middle of it, which brought great wealth from importation of tobacco, cotton and sugar. From the mid-18th to the mid-20th centuries, 30,000 ships were built on the River Clyde, almost 20% of the world tonnage, giving Glasgow the title of second city of the empire. Most of the old has now been swept away as Glasgow continues to reinvent itself, and today you'll find a modern, energetic city with a great deal to offer. We're going to take a short tour around the city to see some of its iconic sites and buildings, and we'll meet John where it all began in the 6th century. And before we set off, let's take a look at the map, zooming into where Glasgow is today, right onto Glasgow Cathedral. And from Glasgow Cathedral, down the High Street, all the way down to Toll Cross, and onto the River Clyde. And from the River Clyde, we'll zoom across the city right into the centre to George Square. From George Square, we'll head west, and we'll go to see the iconic Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. And from Kelvingrove, we'll then head back to the riverside down to the Scottish Exhibition Centre. It's going to be a great trip. Hello, this is John Harbour from Exclusive Scottish Visits Luxury Tours, and welcome to Glasgow. I'm delighted to be working with the American Scottish Foundation to give you a small tour of Glasgow today and show you some of its iconic buildings. And what I'm going to do is show you some medieval, some 19th, 20th century, and also more modern buildings as well. Today I'm actually standing on the site where it all began. It began with a man called St Kentigern, or St Mungo as he's known locally. And he came across in the 6th century with a holy man and buried him here. When St Kentigern died, he too was buried here, and there's a shrine beneath the church that's built on top of his original church. And this church is Glasgow Cathedral, or St Mungo's Cathedral as it's known. It's a beautiful Gothic building, as you can see, and just a little bit more about it. Glasgow Cathedral is the oldest cathedral in mainland Scotland and the oldest building in Glasgow. The original stone cathedral was dedicated in 1197, although much of the present building really dates from about the 13th century. It's a fabulous Gothic construction and took around 150 years to complete. The original stained glass windows were destroyed during the Reformation in 1560, but the structure of the building remains intact, thanks mainly to the merchants of Glasgow, who had contributed so much to the cathedral and did not wish to see it destroyed. It has stood the test of time, and the interior is super, with services still being held within. I am actually standing in the lower church of Glasgow Cathedral, and I've got a lovely backdrop, the symbols of Glasgow right behind me at the moment. What I'm going to do is actually show you St Kentigern, or St Mungo as he's known locally, the shrine in which he is still here, just behind me now. St Kentigern, or St Mungo, came across from the east coast with the body of St Fergus, who is also buried in this church, and established a very small church here near the Mollendinner burn. And from that small church of the 6th century, it's grown into what we have today is a fabulous cathedral, Glasgow Cathedral, or St Mungo's Cathedral as it's known. The cathedral actually is at the top of the old medieval high street, and what we're going to do is actually walk down the high street and see some of the buildings that are here today. So let's just do that right now. Thank you. Before we actually head down the high street, I just want to show you how a city can preserve its heritage. Behind me, for example, is Provin's Lordship, and Provin's Lordship was built as part of St Nicholas Hospital by Andrew Muirhead, the Bishop of Glasgow, in 1471. Provin's Lordship is actually the oldest building in Glasgow alongside the cathedral, and is very well worth a visit. And you can actually visit this lovely place and pop inside and have a look. And directly opposite from Provin's Lordship is the Museum of Religious Art. It's believed to be the only museum in the world on this subject, and looking at construction, it appears to be a very old building, but it was actually completed in 1989 on the site of an old bishop's castle, a great tribute to town planning in Glasgow. And we've just come from the top of the High Street, which was the cathedral, and we're now coming down the High Street, and the buildings are much more modern. And interestingly enough, there's a fabulous mural which actually represents St. Kentigern and one of his miracles when he brought a young bird back to life. So now we're going to just head all the way down the High Street, down to Glasgow Cross. Hi, I'm now standing right at the bottom of the High Street. Actually, it extends further down there to the River Clyde. We'll go there shortly, but I'm in front of the old toll booth. And the old toll booth spire is all that exists today. I'll tell you a little bit about it. The old toll booth tower is quite an iconic image in Glasgow. Lovely blue face there. Comes all the way down. The old toll booth itself has been removed, built in the 17th century, replacing a 14th century. This effectively was the mayor's office. This would have a courtroom, it would have a prison, and indeed if you could look closely at the wall you can see where the iron rings used to be, where the prisoners used to be chained to the door. There were 22 executions that took place here, and this is Glasgow Cross. And directly across the road you have the Market Cross, and the name of the street is actually called the Gallagate. And that reflects the fact that this was a place of execution. Well, we've come all the way down the High Street. The cathedral is right at the top of this street, and it's come all the way down, and we'll be very shortly seeing the River Clyde. Behind me is a lovely building I thought I'd point out. It's very late 19th century, and it's the Justiciary Building, or the High Court of Glasgow. This would try the most serious crimes in Glasgow. The street actually is a continuation of the High Street. This is called the Salt Market, and the Salt Market clearly was used to provide the salt for the fish and the meat, to preserve those products for future sale or even for exportation. Anyway, let's take a look at the final part of the particular street we're on, and we'll go to the River Clyde. Well, this is the extent of what we'd call the medieval city, running all the way down from the cathedral down to the River Clyde. This is where it ends. Glasgow was really built a few hundred years after that, or extended a few hundred years after that, due to the Scottish Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and then the Clyde itself, which contributed greatly to the expansion of Glasgow. The River Clyde provided merchants and ship owners with perfect location to unload their cargoes for trade around Scotland and to load ships ready to sail to the Americas. In the 18th century, the riverbed was deepened to allow for bigger ships. It also became sensible and logical to construct shipyards along the River Clyde and allowing the merchants to actually own their own ships for their own transportation. Well, I'm now standing right in the centre of modern-day Glasgow. This is George Square. George Square, named after the King George III. He was the man who actually lost us the American Civil War, which is the reason he's not on top of the column right in front of you, which has got Sir Walter Scott. If you were standing in George Square in the early 1700s, then you'd been standing in the middle of marshland. Around 1770, Glasgow Corporation actually they bought the land and built some fabulous mansions on it, and some of them are right behind me at this very moment. This is called the Millennium Hotel, and if you look along the side of the Millennium Hotel, you can actually see separate what would have been grand houses, and they were built originally to service the train station, the Queen Street station, which is off to the left, and there's been a huge makeover of this particular station, as you can see, Queen Street Station. Coming back to the Millennium Hotel itself, you can imagine from the frontage beautiful mansion houses separately owned by rich individuals, and these residences, built around late 1700s, early 1800s, would have lined the square. And this set of buildings became the Queen's Hotel in 1855. It was actually used in 1941 when Winston Churchill met President Roosevelt's special envoy, Harry Hopkins, to discuss the ability of the British to continue fighting the Nazis in the Second World War. He was saying, can we still do it? And we said yes, and that's when the Americans came and helped us in the Second World War. We're going to look at another lovely building very shortly. The building which is the pièce de résistance in George Square is the wonderful building behind me. Fabulous Italian Renaissance building called the City Chambers, or in American parlance, it's the Mayor's office. It's absolutely glorious. Designed by William Young, built in 1888, opened by Queen Victoria. Incorporates an Italianate style with a vast array of ornate decoration with columns at every level. And just above the doorway you can see this huge pediment. The door was designed to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And if you look above the pediment, you can see Victoria herself. Depicts her enthroned, surrounded by emblematic figures of Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales, alongside the colonies of the British Empire. The interior is also fabulous, with a magnificent marble staircase, and it's said that it's got the most marble in the world, apart from the Vatican. This really is a fabulous piece of architecture. One thing you can do, of course, you can visit this building. During the week you can actually pop in and they do guided tours. Very well worth doing. Well, still in George Square and directly opposite the city chambers behind you, and behind me now, is the Merchant's House. Another fabulous building, and you can recognise it because if you go right to the top you can actually see a wonderful globe right on the top of the tower there, and there's a sailing ship sitting right on top. Now, the Merchants have always been a powerful body in the city, and as I mentioned at the beginning, they protected Glasgow Cathedral during the worst of the Reformation. And this building's a beautiful example of opulence inside and out, befitting the power and wealth of the merchants. And if you forgot what the building was, the Merchant's House, then the doorway, which is just ahead of us, and above the pediment, you can see, just make out the letters MH. Well, the wonderful dome tower at the top of the building is a ship and a globe, symbolising the worldwide trade in which the merchants were involved. And of course, the merchants were the wealth of Glasgow, as we've seen from the River Clyde. So what did these wealthy merchants spend their money on? Well, one thing were fabulous mansions, and behind me is the Cunningham Mansion. As you can see, built late 19th century, wonderful sandstone building. And Cunningham, he made his money by importing tobacco, but the one thing he did do was had a huge amount of tobacco to sell, which then became scarce due to the American War of Independence. He made a fortune, and this is just one of his mansions that he's built. Subsequently to that, it became the Royal Exchange, and you can see an extension to the side, on the right hand side, and there's an extension on the left hand side as well. Today, the building is the Gallery of Modern Art. Opened in 1996, but it was a bank and the Royal Exchange, and it's great to see 19th century buildings being recycled in such a way. Wonderful mansion in the centre, and then the addition of the columns at the front. Of course, in this day of Black Lives Matter movement, I have to acknowledge the connection of Cunningham and the tobacco, cotton and sugar lords in general with the slave trade, which was a dark period in Scotland's history. Notwithstanding that history, however, it has to be recognised that the rise of trade with the Americas represented an historic landmark in the prosperity of Glasgow and Scotland in general, and the development of shipbuilding on the Clyde. Well, we're at one of the extensions of the Cunningham Mansion, just round the corner, and this is the entry to the Gallery of Modern Art. But I want to show you one more statue in Glasgow, which is iconic of this amazing city. This is the statue of the Duke of Wellington, who won the Battle of Waterloo, stopping the French from taking over Europe. The symbolic aspect, which you will be wondering about, is the traffic cone on his head. Now, this statue was erected in 1844, and in the 1980s, some students placed the traffic cone on his head for fun. And for a number of years, the police tried to stop them, but every time it was taken off, it was replaced. And in 2011, the Lonely Planet Guide included the statue in its list of the top 10 most bizarre monuments on Earth. And it is rather bizarre, but it is iconic. What do you think?
Well, having looked at the Gallery of Modern Art, we head east out of the city centre into Kelvin Park to the wonderful Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum. It's built in a Spanish Baroque style using red sandstone. Above the doorway is Glasgow's patron saint, who we saw earlier, Saint Mungo, looking down on visitors to the gallery. Inside is a great hall, and the centrepiece is the concert pipe organ, which is played every day for the benefit of visitors. The collections are organised into two halves. On one side of the hall is the Life Hall, effectively the museum with natural history, Egyptian antiquities, medieval arms and Scottish history. On the other side is of Europe's great civic art collection, including Scottish, European, African and Asian. Well, from visual arts to performing arts, we've now moved down to the River Clyde where arts are actually performed on this site, and this is the Scottish Exhibition Centre. It was started in 1985 with the building behind me and two major expansions over the years. The first extension is the fascinating building called the SEC Armadillo, opened in 1997, and you can see why it's called the Armadillo. It actually looks a bit like Sydney Opera House. It's got a capacity of about 3,000 people. However, the latest addition to the SEC is the OVO Hydro building, and that was opened in 2017 with a maximum capacity of about 14,300. As I mentioned, we're by the River Clyde, and towering above us is the Finnieston Crane, a relic from the days of Glasgow's shipbuilding supremacy. It's a giant cantilever crane retained as a symbol of the city's engineering heritage. There's 4 remaining on the Clyde, and I went to visit the Titan. I'm standing in front of the Titan Crane, or Titan Clyde Bank as it's known locally. And this 150-foot high crane was used in the heavy lift of engines and boilers into the ships, the cruise liners and also the warships of yesteryear. It was also used further down the Clyde, loading equipment such as steam engines, the steam engines that were built here near the Clyde in the factories locally, which were sent all over the world. You can still find some Clyde-built steam engines around the world today. This was the first electrically powered cantilever crane, and indeed, as you can see yourself, it is a Titan. Well, as we draw away from the Finnieston Crane and the Scottish Exhibition Centre, that's the end of the tour of the iconic buildings and monuments. And you can see that there's so much more to Glasgow than meets the eye, and I've just scratched the surface. But before we finish, I just wanted to share with you 3 other iconic sites to the east of the city, around Glasgow Green, a wonderful green space kept for the people of Glasgow. There's an amazing terracotta fountain, a People's Palace, and a Venetian palace, well, what looks like one anyway, and they are all part of this city. I'm going to leave it to John to tell you much more about them before we finalise the tour. Hi, what I want to actually do right here on this spot is show you some iconic images of the late 19th century built in Glasgow. And the first one behind me is actually a terracotta fountain, probably the largest terracotta fountain in the world. It came from the Doulton factory. It's called the Doulton Fountain, and it was built to commemorate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, and she adorns the top, as you can see. A magnificent piece of ceramic construction. And if we then pan round, you're actually looking at Glasgow Green. And Glasgow Green is a beautiful central green space for the people of Glasgow. And just off to the left, you can see an amazing monument, and that is the Nelson Monument, which commemorates Nelson's great victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. Come left further, and you've actually got the People's Palace. People's Palace, built in the late 1800s for the people of Glasgow, and it basically is a museum of Glasgow life, and is open and free to get in for the people of Glasgow to come and have a look at what their lives used to be like. But pan round even further, and what I'd like to do is to actually focus on this amazing building ahead of me. This is the Templeton Carpet Factory. Mr. Templeton tried to build a factory here, but the people around here are rather affluent and didn't want a factory on their doorstep. So he got a man called Leiper, a great architect of Scotland, to design something totally different. Leiper was used to building fabulous grand houses. What he did was he designed something with a frontage which is exactly a replica of the Doge Palace in Venice. Fabulous. Well, this is the end of the Glasgow City tour, and we hope you've enjoyed this tour of some of the iconic buildings and monuments, even the quirky ones. It's been a pleasure having you with me, so this is John Harbour of Exclusive Scottish Visits Tours of Scotland on behalf of the American Scottish Foundation, wishing you well wherever you are in the world. Slán Java.